Good evening and welcome to Armageddon Live, Series 2, Episode 40, Structure of Daniel 8 through 12, Part 12, on this 12th of June, 2020. I'm your host, Daniel Decrypted. Alright, it's been a little while since 3 days since I did anything. Anyway, to be expected, I'm trying to redo all my pictures over again and it takes a long time. So let's get me out of the way. Alright. Yeah, so again, we're going to look at Daniel 8 through 12. Alright, so this is our structure of Daniel 8 through 12. As you can see, it's a repetition or a parallel. So you have Rise and Fall of Kingdoms, chapters 8 and 9. Then you have Vision of Man in Linen, chapter 10. Then you have Rise and Fall of Kingdoms, chapter 11. And Visions of Man in Linen, chapter 12. And of course, if you look at that in more detail, then of course, chapter 8 is talking about the rise and fall of the four kingdoms. Chapter 9 is talking about the rise and fall of the Jewish nation. Alright, now why is this structure there? Because when you look at it, you have the vision in chapters 8, 1 through 14, and then you have this explanation in verses 15 through 27. Then you have a further explanation given dealing just with the Jewish nation in chapter 9. And then you have a further explanation of the entire thing. So chapter 11, that's what chapter 11 actually is. Because if you look at it, it's just the angel describing or telling Daniel what's going to happen in history. So it's a further explanation or interpretation of the vision of 8, 1 through 14. Now the thing is, what I want to try and show you is how you're supposed to understand chapter 11. Because chapter 11 tends to be very complicated. Alright, so if you do this comparison between chapter 8 and chapter 11, you see these repetition of terms and even phrases. So in both the explanation of given in chapter 8 and the explanation in chapter 11, that's verses 20, you have a mention of Persia. Persia is the first kingdom that's being described. Then you have both chapter 8 and chapter 11 mentioning Grecia. And in the vision it talks about broken toward the four winds. And you have well, you have broken being mentioned in the explanation, but then you have it appearing in the explanation given in chapter 8, but then you have it also given in the explanation in chapter 11. Well, of course, you see the other things that are being repeated too. So the explanation in chapter 8 talks about Gracia, king, broken, 4. Chapter 11 also uses these images, or these terms, king, broken, 4. And then the kingdom that follows Gracia, in the vision it mentions pleasant land, and the explanation given in chapter 11 it mentions glorious land. This is actually the same Hebrew word, except in chapter 8 it doesn't have, land is not actually there. It's an understood term that's there, but it's not actually in the text. It's understood to be there. Then we have in the explanation it mentions countenance or face, and we have 3 occurrences of face in chapter 11. So anyway, the point is that yes, when you look at the chapter 11 versus chapter 8, there's this repetition of terms that tie these 2 chapters together. Now, if we look in the next thing that follows after this, the next kingdom that's being described in the vision is not actually mentioned. Oh, actually, here I'm supposed to show you where the context of each of these terms that's appearing. So, in chapter 8, verse 20, we have the kings of Media and Persia. In chapter 11, verse 2, we have kings in Persia. Then we have in Daniel 8, verse 8, the great horn was broken, and for it came up 4 notable ones towards the 4 winds of heaven. And chapter 11, verse 2 through 4 mentions a mighty king. His kingdom shall be broken and shall be divided towards the 4 winds of heaven, etc. Then in 8, 20, and 22, we have the king of Gracia, the first king, now that being broken, whereas 4 stood up for it, 4 kingdoms shall stand up out of the nation. In chapter 11, 2 through 4, we have the realm of Gracia, a mighty king. His kingdom shall be broken and shall be divided towards the 4 winds of heaven. So yes, it's saying roughly the same thing. Then in 8, verse 9, wax exceeding great toward the pleasant land, that's the little horn. And in chapter 11, talks about, but he shall do according to his own will, and none shall stand before him, and he shall stand in the glorious land, which by his hand shall be consumed. So once again, we're talking about whatever this kingdom is, represented by the little horn. It's destroying the pleasant or glorious land. And here we're talking about some king who's doing the same thing. And these, of course, are the same power, which we'll show later. And finally, we have a king of fierce countenance or face. In chapter 8, verse 23 and 24, and then we have in chapter 11, verse 16 through 22, we have his face, his face, his face. Face mentioned 3 times. Alright, so after that section, we come to the little horn. This is in chapter 8. So in the vision, it's described as we have a vision of a little horn. And in the explanation for chapter 8, given in verses 23 through 25, this little horn power is called a king of fierce countenance. Now we want to look at this term now because is the context of those two things first. So a little horn which waxed exceeding great toward the pleasant land. And in chapter 8, in the explanation, the little horn is called a king of fierce countenance. And then we're told once again the same information: destroy the mighty and the holy people. Of course, to Daniel, the pleasant land is his homeland, Palestine, and to Daniel, the holy people would be the Jews. So it's talking about the same thing. Clearly, it's talking about the same thing. Now, what's the point in this? Okay, so we have this connection here. What we want to look at, though, is the verses that follow these two: the vision of the little horn and the explanation of the little horn. Oh, but first, of course, we want to show you that these verses here, 23 through 25, are actually a unit. So as you can see here, this is a chiasm of those verses. King of fierce countenance and understanding dark sentences shall stand up, and his power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. And he shall destroy wonderfully, and shall prosper and practice, and shall destroy the mighty and the holy people. And through his policy also he shall cause craft to prosper in his hand. So you see that the words of the same color are either the same word or they're linked. Dark sentences is talking about some sort of deceptive hidden undertaking, but that's what craft is too. Very cunning and deceptive. It's interesting. Anyway. Alright, so the verses, we see that there's a division that happens here in the vision of the little horn. We have the little horn who waxes exceeding great towards the south and toward the east and toward the pleasant land. So he's working horizontally on the earth. But then we see there's a change, and it waxed great even to the host of heaven. So now it's moving in a heavenly direction. Its attack is on heaven, while previously it was attacking the earth. And of course you can easily see that this is political movements versus religious movements. Alright, so these are the verses that deal with the religious movement. And what you see is the vision says it waxed great even to the host of heaven. And the interpretation of that is, and he shall magnify himself in his heart. So this is something that's happening in the mind. It's like a pride thing. Attacking, because actually you can't physically attack heaven. And that's what, that's what you see with Lucifer. He couldn't physically attack heaven, but it was something that was happening in his mind, in his heart. Alright, so that we have those two terms that are being linked together, wax great and heart. Because the thing is, yes, it says at the top, Daniel 8 keys to understanding Daniel 11. So these terms, wax great and heart, they are used to interpret Daniel 11. And it cast down some of the host and of the stars to the ground and stamped upon them. Now you can't limit this verse. The second half of verse 10 can't be, you can't limit it to a particular word, but it's the action, it's the idea that's being spoken of here. And this is the idea of God's people being persecuted, right? Thrown to the ground and stamped upon. But then we have this term over here of peace. Now the interesting thing is that if you go into chapter 11, you'll see that these terms appear. And not in some sort of haphazard way. So here's the actual really difficult part of Daniel 11. this structure here. And how do you understand it? From what we just looked over. Just wait. How do we understand it? From the keys that we just looked at. Hey, my thing, like, oh. Let's see if we go back. Alright, we have this key here. But here's those keys in that structure that we just looked at. The structure of Daniel 11:23 through 40. So, peaceably occurs here in verses 23 and 24, linking the peace of Daniel 8 to Daniel 11. Then we have it cast down them of the host and of the stars to the ground. The idea of persecution appears in these verses, which were 32 through 35. Finally, we have this section. In there, there's 3 occurrences of heart. And then we have the Daniel 11 talks about waxing great in this section. Once again, if we look at this verses 36 through 38 and 25 through 28. So anyway, it sets this up, it makes this structure. I know this is very rough. It's because I haven't got everything done yet, but at least you have an idea of the direction I'm going in. And I mean, that's the most difficult part about Daniel 11 is seeing this structure. That's why I've been spending the last 3 days working on this, is because this structure is so difficult. One thing you'll see is this time appointed down here and time of the end. They are connected as being the same thing under this. In verse 32 through 35, it links those two together. As I said, verse 23 and 24 are linked to verse 32 and 35 through 35 through Daniel 8. That's what we just looked at. And the King of the North, verse 25 through 28 and 36 through 38 are also linked through Daniel 8. You get these verse 31 and 38 appearing because they have this very similar idea that's being expressed here. A sanctuary of strength, a fortress of strength. But clearly one is a religious thing and the other is a force, right? It's by force. Fortress is a man-made object. A sanctuary is a place, is a religious thing. Anyway, I guess that's all I can say for now. I guess there's nothing else to really say. Let me see. Yeah, see, The only thing I could show you too is this. Once again, you'll probably see all these things all over again. But see, this is a very important section of Daniel 11 too. It's within that bigger structure I just showed you. But it's important to see these parallels that exist there. So notice that it says that, and the king shall do according to his will, and I've labeled one half of the verses king of the north and the other half as king of the south. The idea of this is that you look at the first half and it mentions God, God of gods, and the God of his fathers. And then it mentions God again. So it's repeating this term over and over again. But you look on the other side and it mentions God twice, but the first mention of God is the God of forces. Or that term can also mean fortresses. And this is carrying the idea that you're worshiping man's own construction, his ability to build fortresses, to build armies, right? This is the power of man. It's not really a god in the sense of anything. It's looking at man to give you, to protect you, to fight for you, right? That's why it's the God of fortresses. And then the other mention of God it makes is a God whom his fathers knew not. And if you look at Daniel 8 and 7, it talks, it goes through the different kingdoms, but in the end, it's actually talking about the church. And so if you look at this, you have one half that dishonors God, and the other half is dependent on man, right? Dependent on fortresses that men build. Or in this case, a God whom his fathers knew not would be something that is not the real God. And in paganism, of course, paganism is the worship of gods that are not real gods, and they're not the real God. So anyway, but notice that it repeats things. So magnify himself above every is the same Hebrew as magnify himself above all. Then you look down at the bottom, it mentions fathers on both sides. And then it mentions desire and pleasant things. Desire and pleasant things are the exact same Hebrew word. So once again, you get this idea that this is a repetition because it's repeating words. But then you look also that it talks about speak marvelous things against, and then it talks about honor. So one is you dishonor the God of gods, but you honor the God of forces. Then it says, neither regard the God of his fathers, nor regard any God. So once again, this idea of dishonoring. But on the other side, it says God whom his fathers knew not, honor. So I hope that's explaining. Of course, the reason you have north and the south is that figuratively the north represents heaven, God, and the south represents man. We'll see that later on when I show you the what are they? Not the symbols. Anyway, the symbolic flags, or the flags with their symbolic images that represent the different tribes, the 4 different camps around the sanctuary in the Exodus. Alright. That's it for now. Gotta get back to work and make some more pictures and stuff. But for now, that's it, that's all. I mean, it takes a while to actually create all of these things so it makes perfect sense and everything. So over the next few days I'll be continuing to do that. But for now, I hope it piqued your interest once again. I hope it was worth your time, and I hope you'll come back. God bless, and good night.